Hi guys, welcome to Learn with W3 Schools. My name is Dr. Zeeshan and today we're going to talk about the ReactJS components and try to clear out the confusion between stateless and stateful components. This is ReactJS for Dummies course, and in this course again today we're going to understand a little bit more about how components work, specifically with respect to stateless and stateful components. So understanding React components and parsing data between them is quite essential. Don't worry if you still find these terms a little confusing and technical. We are going to break them down into distinguishable pieces and relate real world examples so that you can understand and follow along easily. By the end of the session, hopefully you will be confident in handling these concepts like a pro. So today the basic idea that is we were going to cover about basics of React components, what exactly is stateless components versus the stateful components. We're going to define and tell you the difference with real world examples. We're also going to ensure that how you use these state and stateful components to pass the data between each different component. In the end, we're going to look into a few examples to make sure you understand these concepts practically. So by the end of the lesson, you will be able to understand what your components are, the difference between stateless and stateful components, and when to use each of these components. Techniques of passing data between these components, specifically how to handle real world problems using any of which each of these components. So let's begin and let's talk about what exactly are React components. Now, React components are building blocks of your app. Imagine building a Lego model. Each Lego piece represents a React component. And when you connect them together, you build something functional and beautiful. With React, you can reuse these components, access your application, saving time and effort. Plus, React makes it super easy to manage complex UIs by breaking them into smaller, manageable parts. Imagine your app is basically a puzzle, and each piece of is a React component. Okay, components lets you break down the complexity of your app into a smaller, reusable pieces. So instead of creating one giant component, you basically create small pieces together. Okay, then you stack and combine each pieces together to build one complete application. That way you have much more control of what your application is, and then you have something called a reusable components, means you can reuse these same components multiple times within an app or in another applications as well. So instead of writing everything in one big messy file, you create independent self-contained blocks of UI that do one thing and do it well. Components can either be functional or for a simpler tasks or class based, managing more complex behaviors. Okay, so typically we most of the time we end up using the functional components, which is nowadays what we call the stateless component. However, there are something called stateful components or class components. Not so common in latest updated versions. Especially after the update version, we end up still using most commonly this functional component, or as we call them, stateless. Okay, so let's look into the example of a component first. So interactivity is what React excels at. With event handlers, you can make your components respond to users' actions like clicking a button or typing in a box. So for example, if I have to create a basic component, the way I do it is that once I click on a button, I create a constant greeting, which becomes my component, is equals to bracket start bracket close, arrow function. Okay, so this is what we call an arrow function looks like, which is dynamically creating an component, bracket start bracket close. Each component needs to have a return type, which is again one of the most mandatory rules, and then this return type needs to return an HTML. Okay, this basically combines our simple component. Now let's look into that. How does a React component work? React components are smart. They know how to take data, render it as an HTML, and update themselves when something changes. In our shopping list example, the shopping list components passes each item to the items components when they render it. So think of this as a information exchange between your entire website. So how do they work? They basically allow us to render a UI elements. Component receive inputs, for example, using the props, which basically means arguments. Okay, so we pass data using these arguments, and the return output, which is again HTML, which means basically our web page. Okay, so this is how it works. components, this is the first thing, they may need the inputs or arguments or what we call the props, and they generate the output. Okay, so the input form is basically this thing. We get input, the output is HTML, and they combine together in form of a component. So this is how the component basically works. React takes these components, the React takes care of updating the DOM efficiently using a virtual DOM model. So what happens is, as we know that it's a JavaScript, JavaScript uses a DOM model, and then again, obviously React also is heavily implied on the DOM. So DOM is very efficiently implied and updated using this React. With this DOM, React actually uses something called virtual DOM. We have talked about this in our detailed React videos, but that's how our React component works. So data flow, the parent component can pass the data to a child component through props. So our parent component can pass the data to a child component using the props mechanism. Again, using the same assignment. Child components can communicate changes back using the callback function as well. So in other words, we have a parent, and inside the parent we have a child component. So this becomes my child and this becomes my parent. Okay, so now parent can pass the data to the child, as well as child can also refer back the data to the parent using something called a callback function. So using this callback function, a child can pass the data as well. Okay, so I hope you understand this concept easily. Let's look at this another example, rendering the list. So stateless components are like decorators for your app. They don't hold any internal data, they just take the props and render something based on them. So in this case, we have a simple data that is being passed using the props. So we take item, we create a name data, and then we pass it a function called list item name. So it's taking the prop and then printing the data item here. So when we create a shopping list, we have a bracket start bracket close, which is again defining a component feature in terms of an arrow function, bracket start bracket close. Here we define constant items, milk, egg, and bread. Then we return our HTML. Within this HTML, we have an unordered list, and that unordered list takes this item variables. So this item variables here uses the JavaScript's map function to iterate through each item. So this map function is basically used to iterate, okay, through each item in our list. So using the map, we are saying, hey, take this item based on each index, iterate it, and then assign it a particular information, which is in this case the item key. So the item is here, the key becomes our main index, and the name is basically a parameter that we pass it to the name of information as a prop. So what's happening now, again in a nutshell, is that we are reading the data using a simple JavaScript function called map. This map allows us to read the data of our a list. Okay, so this list is basically allowing us to read the data and then passing that data through our map function to this item variable here. So the first thing is, in other words, we have a list. This list is iterated through our map function. This map function will read line by line the data and call this item component. To this item component, we pass the data. So we say, hey, there's a key, which basically becomes our key value, and then the name of that item. So in other words, we are passing it a key and value information. So this information is passed to this thing here. Okay, so that's how a component is basically working. We are updating the component at real time. Okay, so now let's look at another example of stateless components. Again, stateless components are also known as simple functional components. Simple focus, they basically simply focus on presenting UI. They do not manage or hold any state. That's the key thing. We do not manage or hold any state. Any state means while the program is execution, they maintain the value of some data in memory. Okay, that does not happen. So whenever they pass, they process information and the state is lost. That's why they call it stateless. They usually hold the data using the props. So that's for a stateless components, props is quite important. Okay, again the work is we create a component, hello is equals to, and this is the props. So we pass it the information using the props. They have a return data, they process it, and then they use props.name to process that information. This is a simple example of stateless components. Now Talking more about stateless components are like decorators of your app. They don't hold any internal data, they just take in props and they render something based on them. So in this case, again, we have props. They take in the props, which basically means an argument, an input value, and they process that information. In this example, our welcome component is given a username and it displays a greeting. Simple, right? Think of it like a waiter at a restaurant. They don't cook the food, they just deliver it. So that's how they're basically working. So here we have created another component called app. It returns again HTML content, but this HTML content itself is a component called welcome. So this welcome is actually being referred to this welcome here. So from one component we are calling another component. Quite possible, easily done. Then this component takes something called a prop, meaning another argument. So we provided argument in a key is equals to value pair. Okay. So now username becomes our key. Zeeshan, my name, becomes value. So when we pass this information as a whole, this whole becomes one single prop, and this prop is actually passed to this props variable. In order to use it, we use the props, which is again this variables dot username. So the username actually is coming from here. The props is actually coming from here. That's how we actually use the information in a stateless components, meaning passing the data between components from one component to another component using props. Stateful component. Now let's talk more about what exactly we mean by stateful components. Stateful components are like brains of your app. They can remember things like a state or in a form of a state and decide how to behave based on the state. Think of stateful components as your phone. It remembers you saved contacts, tracks calls, and handles all your dynamic actions. That's what our state basically means. So every time you open a phone, you maintain a call log, a call history is maintained. Okay, who called you? Even if you open WhatsApp, you have a history of your chat. That's what we mean by managing a state, remembering your previous actions. Every time you browse on your browser history is maintained, which is again what we call the state. Okay, so that's what a state actually means, also called a class components. And you can create the same thing using functional components as well, especially using the hooks. So if you want to use the functional components, we use the component called functional components with hooks, which now in the latest version is most common. And in my future lessons also, if you follow along, you will find me using functional components with hooks for a stateful components as well. Let's look at the example for this. In a simple counter example, we are using a use state to track the counts and update whenever the button is clicked. How simple and easily it is done, right? So we have a button, we create an event called on click, and then bracket start, bracket close, again an expression. Within this expression, we created a very simple function called set count. Its set count calls this set count function here, which is basically being managed by the use state. So this use state will allow us to remember how many times we have clicked on a button, just like your history, just like your chat history, just like your contacts history, call history, log history. Use state will allow me to remember the value of count and the function it has, the number of time it has executed. That way we can remember the value and the amount of counts that has been done. Okay, so every time when we update this count plus one, it takes its current value and changes it. Okay, that's way our count is always maintained. So building a counter app becomes absolutely easy if you are working with this use state feature. So when you execute it for the first time, it starts from 0. The next time you click on a button, it will increment to 1. The next time you click on it button again, it will increment to 2, 3 and 4. It remembers what was the previous value of a count variable because we are using this use state feature. Now, how do we pass data between components? We have already seen a small examples of this as well already. Passing data between components is like sending message across your team. Props act as this medium. So props are absolutely important and imperative to use within components to pass information between the components. But what if two teams, sibling components, need to share information? That's where we lift the state to the boss, the parent component, and let it manage the data. It's all about calling a teamwork, which basically means working between components. So state lifting is a major concept. It allows us to share states between the siblings. The data we use with the props. But if you want to know the state of a particular component, we use the state lifting concept. So let's look at example of sharing states between siblings. So for example, if I have this and simple program in which I want to share information between my data. So first I create a component called app. It takes constant value, set value, use state. That becomes a standard syntax of anything of which you want to manage a state. This becomes my variable. This becomes my function name or a component name. Then it needs to return anything in specifically HTML. Okay, every component needs to have a return statement, needs to return an HTML content area. Very simple as that. But now we want to return the state as well. So to do that, we call a function called update. Okay, on update we pass the value of set value. What exactly is an update thing? Well, let's look at here. So update is another component here, and then display becomes another component here. So see this is one component, this is second component. We are calling the first component here and the second component here. Every time you call a component, you pass it a value, it goes inside its value here, and that value is basically being printed here like a prop. At the same time, when you pass it on a state, you basically pass the state value information. This will actually shift the state onto the component here, exactly in the same manner. So to passing the props, passing the value, you just pass it the variable's value as well as passing the state function as well. So set value will basically be passed on to on update, and then we can use on update mat.random, which basically means that whenever there's a value change, an update has occurred, the state has changed, you perform a random function and do some calculation on it. Hi. Let's talk more about and see the difference between the stateless versus stateful components. Stateless components are like news reporters. They take information from a script, props, and present it. That's how basically they work. They are simplest type of React components. They receive the data via props and the render UI. That's whole their primary purpose is. They focus on displaying information. That's what we call as stateless components are. Stateful components are like diary writers. They remember things, which we call them state, and update them as needed. Okay, so that's why we said we use stateful components to manage dynamic data, something that needs to be remembered and tracked throughout the program's execution. You can handle user interactions, track changes, and updates. Okay, so every major application nowadays tends to use stateful components to track what user has been doing on my website. That's what we do. But if you just want to process the data, render a UI, and don't not concerned with what user is doing as per se, we use stateless components. Whereas if you want to manage and keep a record of all the activities, all the videos, all the YouTube shorts the user has watched, where he has liked, where has he disliked, what was the previous video he watched, we manage a stateful components. Again, a simple greeting message using stateless function. For example, in this case, our functional component just takes a name prop and displays it. So we have a component called greeting. It takes a component called prop, goes inside the prop and prints the name from it. A simple stateless function doing nothing as separately. Whereas stateful component now remembers what you are trying to do. So it becomes more complex. So while our class-based component remembers the name state internally. In this case, we provide a simple render hello this dot state dot name, means we are asking name from the state rather than prop. This basically means asking the information from our current class. So in my current class, we have a state, find the name, which is again this thing. Class, greeting, extends a React component, creating a class-based component. To create a class-based component, we use the word class, greetings, and we extend React components. Previous examples all have used what we call functional components with useState hook. In this case, the useState hook has not been used. We are just using the class and this variable. So we are saying, hey, I have a constructor. Every class needs to have that. In React.js, we give it a prop value, bracket start, bracket close. Super props needs to refer to the super class variable, which again, a super class constructor, which again is referring to this thing. Again, this is all in my React tutorial in detail when we've talked about it. But this is just the basic things. So now here's the state this we managing. So we use this dot state is equal to name dot world, and then this name is actually referred here. So you can see this name comes here. This dot state becomes the built-in feature of managing the states. Okay. In this example, we split responsibilities. The user details component is stateless. It simply displays information. User profile component is stateful. It manages the name and age. By dividing the task, our code is easier to read and reuse. Imagine you are building a social media app. Each user's profile page could be built like this, and with a separate components for editing and displaying information. Okay, so here we just take the user information. We pass it the props, name and age, and we display it. That becomes one task. Next, we manage the user's activity using the user profile. So the user profile component is what we call stateful. It manages the name and age. By dividing the task, our code is easier to read and simpler. Okay, so here we have a variable, take a user profile information, we read through user.react. So this is where our state is being managed. Again, this is what we call a functional component. Okay, so this is a functional component. Previous example was class component. Because we are using functional component, we need to use the state. Okay, using the use state function. This one, this is again a part of our React hooks. Want to learn more? Again, do follow along. I have a complete 2 3 4 hour tutorial on components, hooks and React using W3 schools. So hopefully that should give you a much more in depth of how things are working with that. So let's look at another example, a simple light bulb toggle. The stateful component shines when you need dynamic behavior. In our light bulb example, the is on state, this one, tracks whether the bulb is on or off. So using this information here, we track whether my bulb is on or off. When the button is clicked, the state flips. So if when I click on a button, I set the on off with this not operator. So this using this not operator here, I flip the state. Okay, so if let me just erase this so you can see this better. So this not operator is here. When the button is clicked, the state flips and the React automatically updates the UI. This is React magic. It does the heavy lifting for you and you don't have to refresh the page. So what did we learn today? So React components are basically reusable building blocks. Use stateless components for presentation and stateful ones for dynamic behavior. Pass the data effectively using the props and the state feature. That's end of the session. I hope you have learned and understood the concept of state and stateless. Still want to learn more? Follow along. Let me know in the comments what you found interesting and what you hate about it. Don't forget to like and share this video with your friends. Please leave a comment. Thank you for watching and do check out these other cool videos as well. This is Dr. Zeeshan signing off.